The Polish foreign minister raised a scenario where the US could attack Russian troops in Ukraine. Russia attacked strongly in the east, Ukraine sent troops to the north. G7 makes progress in using Russia's frozen assets. The Polish foreign minister raised a scenario where the US could attack Russian troops in Ukraine. Poland's top diplomat raised a situation where the US might attack Russian troops participating in a special military operation in Ukraine. Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski said in an interview on May 25 that the US had said that if Moscow used nuclear weapons, Washington would respond by using conventional weapons against Russian forces in Ukraine. The Americans told the Russians that if a nuclear bomb was used, even if it killed no one, Washington would attack all Russian targets, positions, in Ukraine with conventional weapons. Normally, the US would destroy all of them, Mr. Sikorski told The Guardian. Additionally, Mr. Sikorski added that both China and India appear to be warning Russia not to use nuclear weapons. Mr. Sikorski also said that he supports ending the bans that prevent Ukraine from using Western weapons to attack targets within Russia, similar to a recent call by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. In March, Russian President Vladimir Putin said the country is always in a state of combat readiness and completely ready for a nuclear war. However, Mr. Putin said at that time that Russia had never faced the need to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, where the conflict between the two countries has broken out since February 2022. However, Mr. Putin affirmed that Russia will be ready to use nuclear weapons if its sovereignty is threatened. Earlier this month, the Kremlin announced the organization of tactical nuclear weapons exercises of the Russian military. Tactical nuclear weapons are weapons designed for use on the battlefield, have a smaller design and are used at short distances, unlike strategic nuclear weapons which are used to attack targets. Strategic targets at a distance. The Russian Defense Ministry said that the tactical nuclear missile exercises will aim to maintain the readiness of human resources and equipment of units to use non-strategic nuclear weapons in response and unconditional guarantee of Russia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The Russian Foreign Ministry described the tactical nuclear missile exercises as an attempt by Moscow to cool down hot heads in Western countries, as they threaten to deploy forces in Ukraine and carry out another step risks escalating the war in Ukraine into a full-blown conflict between Russia and NATO. Russia attacked strongly in the east, Ukraine sent troops to the north. Russia has stepped up its attacks on the strategically important town of Chasiv Yar and other targets in eastern Ukraine, taking advantage of the fact that some Kyiv units have been redirected to counter the renewed offensive by Moscow and Kharkiv. Russia increased its attacks on the east. Military observers say that if Chasiv Yar falls, Russia will attack the last remaining cities in Donetsk including Kostiantynivka, Druzhivka, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, Ukraine's main defense line in the area. Meanwhile, Kyiv launched multiple UAV and drone attacks, targeting Russia's oil refineries, oil depots, airports and ports, and sank the last missile ship Russia had in the sea. Black. Ukrainian officials have warned of further attacks in Kharkov, and some observers have noticed a new Russian military buildup north of the city of Sumy, a possible warning sign for a new attack. However, according to Al Jazeera, Ukraine has so far managed its relatively thin resources effectively enough to deal with Russian attacks. Moscow's forces launched a company-sized mechanized attack on Chasiv Yar on May 17 and 18, including 2 tanks and 21 infantry fighting vehicles. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said at least 20 vehicles were destroyed. The Washington-based Institute for the Study of War, ISW, said that this was the first Russian attack of such a scale in the past 6 weeks, because Moscow's forces sought to take advantage of the pressure put on their forces. Ukrainian Defense Forces after the attack in Kharkov. Ukrainian forces recently transferred troops of a defense brigade in Chasiv Yar to Vovchansk, and Russian forces may have increased defensive operations near Chasiv Yar to quickly take advantage of the possibility Ukraine's weakening defense, ISW assessed. Mr. Zelensky told Reuters that Russia's attack on Kharkov has stabilized, while the real fighting is taking place in the east. No one even noticed that there was actually more fighting in the east of the country, especially in the Donbass-oriented areas, Kurakhov, Pokrovsk, and Chasiv Yar. The main thrust of the attack on Kharkov is aimed at Vovchansk, about 40 kilometers northeast of the city, where Russian troops have conducted raids over the past week but have only captured about a quarter of the town. Russia's second line of attack in Kharkov is trying to reach the village of Lipsy, but Zelensky said Ukraine has stalled both efforts. The Economist has revealed details of an undated attack plan, which requires Russian forces to reach a point 16 kilometers from the border within 72 hours to put Kharkov within range. These details reveal how Russia is trying to go as far as possible. Ukraine's challenge. A Ukrainian official told the Washington Post that Russian jamming and electronic warfare systems blinded surveillance UAVs flying daily along the border in the hours before the attack, delaying the mobilization of forces. Defense of Ukraine. Vovchansk Mayor Tamaz Gambarashvili also told the New York Times that in the months before the attack, a combination of Russian surveillance UAVs and artillery fire hindered Ukrainian soldiers trying to build trenches and concrete bunkers, leaving the first line of defense unprepared. Mr. Tamaz Gambarashvili said, "Russia is constantly shelling everything we are building." Meanwhile, President Zelensky sought to reassure people at a press conference. "This is the first line, a line built by our army, exposed to continuous fire. The first and second lines were built by the military, and the third line was built by the local government. It is the strongest force, not because they are better than the army, but simply because they are far from the range of weapons and shelling." At the same time, Mr. Zelensky is said to have increased pressure on Washington to allow Ukraine to use US-supplied weapons in Russian territory. So far, Britain is the only NATO member to declare that Ukraine can do so. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd J. Austin reiterated the stance of President Biden's administration that our desire is for Ukraine to continue to use the weapons we provide to target inside the territory of Ukraine. However, military observers say defending Ukraine is impossible if Russia can concentrate its forces on the other side of the border without being attacked. The Russian Air Force can attack no less than 2,480 Ukrainian settlements in the Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkov regions without leaving Russian airspace, said ISW expert George Barros. G7 makes progress in using Russia's frozen assets. G7 finance ministers said that specifying how to use profits from Russia's frozen assets to support Ukraine is still under discussion. On May 25, finance ministers of the group of 7 industrialized countries said they had made progress in using profits from frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine, but still a final agreement has not been reached. The draft statement by G7 finance ministers reads, "We are making progress in discussions on the possibility of using the huge profits from Russia's frozen assets to benefit Ukraine." However, the ministers said that specifying how to implement this is still under discussion. Previously, Economic Commissioner of the European Union (EU), Paolo Gentiloni assessed that negotiations within the framework of the G7 conference in Stresa, Italy, could lead to an agreement next June on the opening of the G7 conference in Stresa, Italy. Exploit profits from frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. G7 finance ministers are discussing how to withdraw money from the €300 billion, $325 billion, frozen assets of the Russian central bank. This past week, the EU officially approved a plan to use profits from Russian assets frozen by the bloc, a move the EU hopes will generate up to €3 billion a year to support Ukraine. A more ambitious idea being discussed in the G7, proposed by the United States, involves the formation of a $50 billion loan to Ukraine based on interest generated by Russian assets. Mr. Gentiloni suggested that talks would continue at the G7 summit in Puglia next June, but cited ongoing positive convergence in Stresa. According to him, in the medium term, this could lead to an agreement approved by the leaders of the G7 countries. On the same day, speaking on the sidelines of the G7 Finance Ministers Conference, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said she did not see any obstacles in discussions with her G7 counterparts on larger loans for Ukraine, supported by income from frozen Russian assets. Meanwhile, World Bank, WB, President Ajay Banga, who also attended the conference in Strisa, affirmed that he is absolutely open to the possibility of implementing the idea of managing a loan fund for Ukraine supported by the G7. Financed by income from frozen Russian sovereign assets, at least for non-military purposes. Mr. Bunga shared, "If they decide to give it to us, I can manage a fund of that kind. I will need safeguards. I need to make sure that our people understand how to use the fund there." He explained this would include agreeing with loan sponsor countries on the process for allocating capital to projects.